Vulgar Latin or Summa vulgaris is a generic term for the non-standard sociolects of Latin from which the Romance languages developed. Works written in Latin during classical times used Classical Latin rather than Vulgar Latin, with very few exceptions. Because of its non-standard nature, Vulgar Latin had no official orthography. Vulgar Latin is sometimes also called Colloquial Latin, or Common Romance. In Renaissance Latin, Vulgar Latin was called Vulgari Latinum or Latinum Vulgari. Proto Romance. Vulgar Latin is often confused with Proto Romance. Proto Romance is a proto-language, i.e., the latest stage common to all of the Romance languages. Because some of the less familiar Romance languages branched off earlier than others, followed by Romanian and related Eastern Romance languages, it is also common to reconstruct later stages, e.g., Proto-Continental Romance, Proto-Italo-Western Romance, and Proto-Western Romance. Proto-Romance and the other proto-languages are theoretical, unitary linguistic constructions. Vulgar Latin, on the other hand, is the actual speech of the common people during the late Roman Empire. As a result, it is not simply theoretical but actually attested, and is not unitary, with differences over both time and space. Hence, it is possible to speak of, for example, the loss of initial j in unstressed syllables in the Vulgar Latin of Cantabria, whereas it is meaningless to speak of a similar change in the Proto-Romance of Cantabria. Origin of the term. The term common speech, which later became Vulgar Latin, was used by inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Subsequently it became a technical term from Latin and Romance language philology, referring to the unwritten varieties of a Latinized language spoken mainly by Italo-Celtic populations governed by the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Traces of their language appear in some inscriptions, such as graffiti or advertisements. The educated population mainly responsible for Classical Latin might also have spoken Vulgar Latin in certain contexts depending on their socio-economic background. The term was first used improperly in that sense by the pioneers of Romance language philology, François-Just-Marie Reynaud and Friedrich Christian Diez. In the course of his studies on the lyrics of songs written by the troubadours of Provence, which had already been studied by Dante Alighieri and published in De Vulgari Eloquentia, Reynaud noticed that the Romance languages derived in part from lexical, morphological, and syntactic features that were Latin, but were not preferred in Classical Latin. He hypothesized an intermediate phase and identified it with the Romana lingua, a term that in countries speaking Romance languages meant nothing more or less than the vulgar speech as opposed to literary or grammatical Latin. Diez, the principal founder of Romance language philology, impressed by the comparative methods of Jacob Grimm in Deutsche Grammatik, which came out in 1819 and was the first to use such methods in philology, decided to apply them to the Romance languages and discovered Reynaud's work, Grammaire comparée des langues de l'Europe latine dans les rapports avec la langue des troubadours, published in 1821. Describing himself as a pupil of Reynaud, he went on to expand the concept to all Romance languages, not just the speech of the troubadours, on a systematic basis, thereby becoming the originator of a new field of scholarly inquiry. Diez, in his flagship work on the topic, Grammatik der romanischen Sprachen, Grammar of the Romance languages, first published in 1836 to 1843 and multiple times thereafter, after enumerating 6 Romance languages that he compared, Italian and Wallachian, Spanish and Portuguese, and Provençal and French, asserts that they had their origin in Latin, but nicht aus dem klassischen Latein, not from Classical Latin, rather aus der römischen Volkssprache oder Volksmundart, from the Roman popular language or popular dialect. These terms, as he points out later in the work, are a translation into German of Dante's Vulgari Latinum and Latinum Vulgari, and the Italian of Boccaccio, Latino Vulgar. These names in turn are at the end of a tradition extending to the Roman Republic. The concepts and vocabulary from which Vulgar Latinum descend were known in the classical period and are to be found amply represented in the Unabridged Latin Dictionary. Starting in the late Roman Republic, Marcus Tullius Cicero, a prolific writer, whose works have survived in large quantity, and who serves as a standard of Latin, and his contemporaries, in addition to recognizing the lingua latina, also knew varieties of speech under the name Serma. Latin could be Serma Latinis, but in addition was a variety known as Serma Vulgaris, Serma Vulgi, Serma Plebeius and Serma Quotidianis. These modifiers inform post-classical readers that a conversational Latin existed, which was used by the masses in daily speaking and was perceived as lower class. These vocabulary items manifest no opposition to the written language. There was an opposition to higher class, or family Latin in Serma Familiaris, and very rarely literature might be termed Sermia Nobilis. The supposed Serma Classicus is a scholarly fiction unattested in the dictionary. All kinds of Serma were spoken only, not written. If one wanted to refer to what in post-classical times was called classical Latin, one resorted to the concept of Latinitas or Latine. If one spoke in the lingua or Serma Latinus, one merely spoke Latin, but if one spoke Latin or Latinus, one spoke good Latin. And formal Latin had Latinitas, the quality of good Latin, about it. After the fall of the Empire and the transformation of spoken Latin into the early Romance languages, the only representative of the Latin language was written Latin, which became known as Classicus, classy Latin. The original opposition was between formal or implied good Latin and informal or vulgar Latin. The spoken-written dichotomy is entirely philological. History. Vulgar Latin developed differently in the various provinces of the Roman Empire, gradually giving rise to the different Romance languages. Joseph Herman states, "It seems certain that in the 6th century, and quite likely into the early parts of the 7th century, people in the main Romanized areas could still largely understand the biblical and liturgical texts and the commentaries that formed part of the rites and of religious practice, and that even later, throughout the 7th century, saints' lives written in Latin could be read aloud to the congregations with an expectation that they would be understood." We can also deduce, however, that in Gaul, from the central part of the 8th century onwards, many people, including several of the clerics, were not able to understand even the most straightforward religious texts. As early as 722, in a face-to-face meeting between Pope Gregory II, born and raised in Rome, and Saint Boniface, an Anglo-Saxon, Boniface complained that he found Pope Gregory's Latin speech difficult to understand, a clear sign of the transformation of Vulgar Latin in two regions of Western Europe. At the Third Council of Tours in 813, priests were ordered to preach in the vernacular language, either in the rustica lingua Romanica, or in the Germanic vernaculars, since the common people could no longer understand formal Latin. Within a generation, the Oaths of Strasbourg, a treaty between Charlemagne's grandsons, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, was proffered and recorded in a language that was already distinct from Latin. From approximately this point on, the Latin vernaculars began to be viewed as separate languages, developing local norms and, for some, orthographies of their own, so that Vulgar Latin must be regarded not as extinct, since all modern Romance varieties are its continuation, but as replaced conceptually and terminologically by multiple labels recognizing regional differences in linguistic features. Vocabulary. Vulgar Latin featured a large vocabulary of words that were productive in Romance. Phonology. There was no single pronunciation of Vulgar Latin, and the pronunciation of Vulgar Latin in the various Latin-speaking areas is indistinguishable from the earlier history of the phonology of the Romance languages. See the article on Romance languages for more information. Evidence of changes. Evidence of phonological changes can be seen in the late 3rd century Appendix Pro B. a collection of glosses prescribing correct classical Latin forms for certain vulgar forms. These glosses describe a process of syncope, the loss of unstressed vowels in medial syllables, the merger between pre-vocalic e and short I, the leveling of the distinction between o and u and e and I, regularization of irregular forms, regularization and emphasis of gendered forms, leveling of the distinction between b and with between vowels, the substitution of diminutives for unmarked words, the loss of syllable final nasals or their inappropriate insertion as a form of hypercorrection, the loss of h, both initially and within the word. Many of the forms castigated in the Appendix Pro B prove to be the productive forms in Romance, e.g., auricular is the source of French ora, Catalan orella, Spanish oreja, Italian orecchia, Romanian eurica, Portuguese orella, ear, not the classical Latin form. Consonant development. The most significant consonant changes affecting Vulgar Latin were palatalization, lenition, and loss of final consonants. Loss of final consonants. The loss of final consonants was already underway by the 1st century AD in some areas. A graffito at Pompeii reads Quisque ama valia, which in classical Latin would read Quisque samet valiate, which played such an important part in the development of palatalization. On the other hand, this loss of final t was not general. Old Spanish and Old French preserved a reflex of final t up through 1100 AD or so, and modern French still maintains final t in some liaison environments. Lenition of stops areas north and west of the La Spezia Rimini line lenited into vocalic p, t, k, 2, b, d. This phenomenon is occasionally attested during the imperial period, but it became frequent by the 7th century. For example, in Merovingian documents, rotatico greater than rodatico. Loss of word final m. The loss of the final m was a process which seems to have begun by the time of the earliest monuments of the Latin language. The epitaph of Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, who died around 150 BC, reads Tauriasia Sasorna Samnio Sepit, which in classical Latin would be Taurisium, Sasornum, Samnium Sepit. This, however, can be explained in a different way, that the inscription simply fails to note the nasality of the final vowels. Consonant cluster simplification. In general, many clusters were simplified in Vulgar Latin. For example, ns was changed to per second, reflecting the fact that n was no longer consonantal. In some inscriptions, mensis greater than mesis, or consul greater than consul. Descendants of mensis include Portuguese emis, Spanish and Catalan emis, Old French emiis, Italian messa. In some areas, the clusters Minnesota, KT, Court, Ks, X were assimilated to the second element, NN, TT, SS. Thus, some inscriptions have omnibus greater than onibus, indictiona greater than indiciona, vixit greater than bisset. Also, three consonant clusters usually lost the middle element. For example, mTors greater than imTors. Not all areas show the same development of these clusters, however. In the East, Italian has KT greater than TT, as in octo greater than otto or nocta greater than notta, while Romanian has KT greater than PT. By contrast, in the West, the K was turned into J. In French and Portuguese, this caused the diphthongization of the previous vowel, while in Spanish, this developed further to T. Also, many clusters including J were simplified. Several of these groups seem to have never been fully stable. This dropping has resulted in the word parietem turning into Italian parete, Romanian parete, greater than pareta, Portuguese pareda, Spanish paired, or French pawa. The cluster KWQU was simplified to K in most instances. In 435, one can find the hypercorrective spelling quisquentis for quiescentis. Modern languages have followed this trend. For example, Latin key has become Italian chi, and French key, while quem becomes quien in Spanish and retains quem in Portuguese. However, kw has survived in front of in most areas, although not in French, hence Latin quattro yields Spanish quattro, Portuguese quattro, and Italian quattro, but French quatre, where the qu spelling is purely etymological. Vowel development in general, the 10-vowel system of Classical Latin, which relied on phonemic vowel length. System in Classical Latin. Classical Latin had 10 different vowel phonemes, grouped into 5 pairs of short-long a, e, I, o, u. It also had 4 diphthongs, a, o, u. Finally, there were also long and short y, representing y in Greek borrowings, which, however, probably came to be pronounced I, even before Romance vowel changes started. Thus the vowel inventory is usually reconstructed as a, e, I, o, u. Monophthongization. Many diphthongs had begun their monophthongization very early. It is presumed that by Republican times, a had become, in unstressed syllables, a phenomenon that would spread to stressed positions around the 1st century AD. From the 2nd century AD, there are instances of spellings with e instead of a. O was always a rare diphthong in Classical Latin, and became e during early imperial times. Thus, one can find penum for penum. However, o lasted much longer. While it was monophthongized to o in areas of north and central Italy, it was retained in most Vulgar Latin, and it survives in modern Romanian. There is evidence in French and Spanish that the monophthongization of o occurred independently in those languages. Loss of distinctive length and near-close mergers. Length confusions seem to have begun in unstressed vowels, but they were soon generalized. In the 3rd century AD, Tacitus mentions people's tendency to shorten vowels at the end of a word, while some poets show inconsistencies between long and short vowels in versification. However, the loss of contrastive length caused only the merger of a and a, while the rest of pairs remained distinct in quality. E, I, O, U. Also, the near-close vowels, and, became more open in most varieties and merged with e and o, respectively. As a result, the reflexes of Latin pera, pair, and vera, through, rhyme in most Romance languages. Italian and Spanish pera, vera. Similarly, Latin nusum, walnut, and vocem, voice, become Italian nos, voce, Portuguese noz, voz. There was likely some regional variation in pronunciation, as the Romanian languages and Sardinian evolved differently. In Sardinian, all corresponding short and long vowels simply merged with each other, creating a 5-vowel system, a, e, I, o, u. In Romanian, the front vowels e, I evolved like the Western languages, but the back vowels o, u evolved as in Sardinian. A few southern Italian languages behave like Sardinian or Romanian, a Western Lucania. Phonologization of stress. The placement of stress did not change from Classical to Vulgar Latin, and words continue to be stressed on the same syllable they were before. However, the loss of distinctive length disrupted the correlation between syllable weight and stress placement that existed in Classical Latin, where in Classical Latin the place of the accent was predictable from the structure of the word. It was no longer so in Vulgar Latin. Stress had become a phonological property and could serve to distinguish forms that were otherwise homophones. Lengthening of stressed open syllables. After the Classical Latin vowel length distinctions were lost in favor of vowel quality, a new system of allophonic vowel quantity appeared sometime between the 4th and 5th centuries. Around then, stressed vowels in open syllables came to be pronounced long, and all the rest became short. For example, long Venice /*v.nis, fori /*f.re, cathedra /*car.te.dre, but short venda /*ven.do, formas /*for.mas. However, in some regions of Iberia and Gaul, all stressed vowels came to be pronounced long. For example, porta /*pr.tar, tempus /*tm.pus.